So very good afternoon to everyone, and thanks, Pinsent Masons, for having me here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about AI and software as a medical device from a clinical as well as regulatory and legal standpoint. Before I start, just want to kind of ask you all and give some food for thought. What would you guys say if I said that in the future, hospitals are just not going to exist? Or if they did, that they would actually have no patients? Would you guys think that I'm crazy or mad, foolish? And then what if I said that in the future, AI-enabled, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, will actually play a significant role in things like preoperative planning, when we operate in the operating theater, etc. And then what if I took it one step further and said, what about in the future if I said data exchange between people and organizations across countries may actually become the norm with benefits to all stakeholders, not just some? And what if I said clinically validated digital twins of the human body will exist? And I guess lastly, what if I said to you that sometime in the future, health tech, including AI specifically, because we're talking about AI, and wearable technology will actually revolutionize the way we deliver care? I ask these questions because if you think about it, all of this exists already, right? Mobile hospitals instead of hospitals, or at least concepts of them. Hospitals without any patients. This was in China back in 2015. I'm going to go through these slides. I'm happy to share them with all the participants on this after the talk. So I'm just going to go through them relatively quickly in the interest of time. Things like using AR and VR in the operating theater. These are companies that actually exist. Those are images that are actually in use today, either being tested or actually approved. Data exchange in the US, our colleagues in PwC back in 2015-16 lowered the cost of diabetic care in southern rural Texas, which has the poorest patient demographics, through a data exchange that allowed data sharing between all entities in the US, the carers, the Walmarts, the CVS pharmacies. We have clinically validated digital twins of the human body already that are used for research purposes and clinical purposes. Some of these pictures that you see here, SpeedDoc on the right there, the company many of you in Singapore will be familiar with, the Time magazine cover. While that's not mainstream yet, that is the future of technology. We have seen in concept that screens being able to be projected onto our skin, in front of our faces using goggles or contact lenses. And then the last point I'd share as food for thought is, if you thought this is really only happening in the West or developed countries, you'd be wrong. It's happening in the growth and emerging markets as well. This was a picture shared with me by my friend and colleague, Professor Shafi Ahmed, who's the world's most watched surgeon during his time in Gaza and Palestine when he was delivering care. So the bottom line is we are truly living in one of the most transformational times in human history. For those of you who have some time, I'd urge you to Google Change Squared by Gerd Leonhard, the top left here, and watch a 2-minute video on what he thinks the future is. Fantastic video. Before I talk a little bit more about AI in healthcare, I always like to use Bill Gates' quotes, one of my favorite quotes, that we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years, but underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. So I think it's somewhere in between. The question really is, in today's day and age, is it that simple? And the reason I ask this is because of these 4 trends that you see here on the slide, what I like to call the ABCDs. So we have intelligent automation and artificial intelligence, and we'll talk a little bit more about AI going forward, big data and the use of it, consumerism, and digital. And I'd just like to highlight that from what we see in the market, the biggest, most important trend here is the C, the consumerism. And I put the icon or picture of Eric Topol's famous book called The Patient Will See You Now, because I feel that that really kind of encapsulates what we're seeing today. Today, it's not about the doctor who will see you now. Patients are demanding, patients are customers, and they want the same conveniences that they get in all other industries, be it shopping, booking a hotel, booking a flight, etc. Always give the example of supermarket shopping. My wife and I hardly ever go to the supermarket. She orders everything online, comes the same day. We don't need to step out. We want those conveniences in healthcare. And it's been a laggard traditionally of all industries, but that is changing. So I think on an overall perspective, I want to share this thought that really we are seeing a convergence of what you see here on this slide. Healthcare, medtech, and now also software as a medical device under medtech, and pharma. And it's because of the realization that each of these can either provide maximum value or no, resolve clinical problems and disorders that we see as clinicians independently. You have to bring them all together. So this term, the new health economy, is essentially what we feel from a PwC standpoint exists. This new health economy that we're seeing is one where we are seeing new entrants, which are basically players traditionally not in the healthcare space. And it's like the David and Goliath story, right? The new entrants are really revolutionizing the way that they do care. And they're being better and bigger than some of the giants like Amazon, Google, Apple, etc. They're using new business models, new technology, new ways of financing themselves, and ultimately delivering new healthcare models. This new ecosystem is going to be predictive, preventative, personalized, and participatory. And when I say personalized, I actually mean hyper-personalized. It's not even about personalized medicine anymore. It's hyper-personalized medicine. But ultimately, it is all about connected care. That is what it is. And this term AI that we often throw around loosely, and we'll talk about that in a second, is often said to play the underlying role in this connected care ecosystem. Unfortunately, this fear of man and machine, is in many, right? Now, a statistic from 2 years ago, I haven't seen the updated figure, but 2 years ago, it was said that AI bots will probably power about 85% of customer service interactions. I don't know how true that is, but very, very believable. And then we have people like Ray Kurzweil, who have a theory of singularity, which is a pretty scary thought, right? This picture is kind of like the Matrix. Are we going to an environment where man and machine, we're plugged into the computer, right? With AI running everything and making decisions and making treatment plans. Is that where we're headed? How realistic is this? Anytime I discuss this with people, the first company usually that comes to people's mind is Theranos. Unfortunately, Theranos left a sour taste in many people's mouths with what they claimed, right? So we have to be careful. But if we look and plot where we think healthcare is going and where AI is going, right, I would ask you to just look at this graph, okay? And you can see here on the far right, 2030 and beyond, which is only 8 years away, we've written something here, said tissue technology singularity, right? Where AI and nanotechnology allow this. And at the bottom of the graph, you see the word healthcare, right? If you think that this is unrealistic, just switch the word healthcare with the word internet. Now, I'm old enough to remember the internet. I hope most people on this call are old enough to remember times before the internet came about, the times of the floppy drive or the floppy disk and starting up your computer and waiting 5 to 8 minutes for it to start up, right? But if you look at the time the internet has come about, we actually now have the internet in our pockets, right? Inside us, we have contact lenses where you can look at the screen of Google, right? So it's not too far-fetched if you think about it. In a period of 20 years, we have actually gone to that extreme. From an academic point of view, there was a journal article that said, when will AI exceed human performance? As a surgeon, I've highlighted the red arrow there. It is said that by 2053, that surgeons will be replaced completely. I might be biased, I don't think so, but it's an interesting perspective. About 5 years ago, PwC published a piece called What Doctor? Why AI and Robotics Will Define New Health. So again, this is nothing new that we're discussing. We've started to see this years ago. The intelligence statistic I wanted to share from this, though, is look at what the two lines that I've circled. The first one on the top, a majority of people already 5 years ago believed that an intelligent healthcare assistant to monitor their diabetes would be very possible. And if you look at to replace a human as a doctor, only 22% believe that. In our most recent survey, that is still the case. It's in the 20s for the replacing as a human doctor. And I'll share a bit of a message at the end of this talk. So I think rather than thinking of man versus machine, we should really think about it as man and machine. And if we do, I always give the Aviva example. Back in 2017, 5 years ago, Aviva asked all its employees, do you think that a robot can replace you in time to come? Do you think automation and AI will replace you? And if you answered yes, they pledged to you that they would not let you go, that they would retrain and reskill you and keep you in a job. Eric Topol's second book, How Artificial Intelligence Can Make Healthcare Human Again. I love that title because I think it's not about AI and it's not about technology. As a clinician, what I value most is the patient interaction that I have, that human touch. And I think that technology can augment that. I don't think technology will replace it, at least not in our lifetime. Maybe in my 20-month-old son's lifetime, perhaps, because if you think about it, you see 9-month and 1-year-old kids now in supermarkets using iPads. You see people they don't want to leave their home, right? There's no socializing anymore. They're on games and virtual reality environments. We talk about the metaverse. So whether that younger generation really likes the human touch, only time will tell. It's not just about global. These are examples of what we're doing with AI locally, a couple more examples as well. But it's not replacing us. It's just augmenting what we do. We've gone from a time of horse-drawn carriages, which is why they were called flying ambulances, because they were horse-drawn, to remote patient monitoring that you see here on the left, where AI is built into a lot of the technology that we see. This was out of the Netherlands, a drone. If you collapsed a defibrillator, video pops up, human on the other side tells you where to place, or rather the AI tells you where to place the leads, and then a human tells you what to do. These pictures of using AI and AR and VR in the operating theater and in medical education all already exist. Again, I shared these pictures earlier. At the end of the day, it's just a number of categories when it comes to healthcare. And then the last graphic I'd like to share is this. If you look at it, we recently kind of tried to come up with a categorization of technology, right? And so on the left, awareness and education all the way through to prophylactics, diagnostics, therapeutics, and follow-up, that encompasses the entire patient journey. And then on the top right, we have non-SaMD, SaMD, hardware, and pharmaceuticals, right? And if you look, where does AI fit into this? It is the biggest balloon here in that kind of nudish pink color. So AI applies to all these solutions in various ways. So on that, let's kind of ask ourselves some questions. But before we do, one thing I'd like to share, and I totally agree with Sid, he shared really nice examples of what works and what doesn't. And so I think it's extremely important to understand some of the risks associated with AI when it comes to healthcare. So the first thing is algorithm bias. The data itself or the coder for it could be biased, and we should ask ourselves that, right? The second would be wrong decisions or recommendations, because not all scenarios are accounted for. At the end of the day, man still plugs in scenarios for algorithms. The third thing is unethical outcomes, because AI, or at least in the definition that people use today, doesn't incorporate compassion and empathy. It can't. And then the last point is data privacy, security, and governance, which I think is the biggest concerns that people generally talk about. So malfunctioning of systems, cyber hacks, etc. But I keep saying this term AI is being thrown around. So what actually is AI? That, I think, is a fundamental question. It is not intelligent automation. And if we talk about John McCarthy, who most people would consider being the father of AI, back in 1956, he said that it's defined as machine simulation that encompasses every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence precisely described. So if we use that definition, I would challenge anyone to say, if you know of a true AI, by definition of AI, a true AI and healthcare solution, please let me know, because I have not come up or ever seen one to date. What we see are subsets of AI, machine learning, deep learning, but not true AI. Is there anything to say about AI in healthcare? Sure, there are loads of use cases and we can spend all day talking about them, right? This graphic just gives some of the examples. And what applications currently exist from a practical and clinical standpoint? This is a non-exhaustive list I just put together off the top of my head. And then the question is really, are there any applications that have already been mainstream? And this comes back to my mentioning of that 5 to 20% of technologies of health tech being clinically adopted, right? Have any of these been mainstream? But what do we mean by mainstream? It's also another term that we fling around so easily. You can look at mainstream in two ways. From a practical, non-monetary perspective, which is what I've shown here. So out of that list, only these 7, I would say, have been mainstream. They're actually clinically adopted, pretty mainstream. You can see them, all around the world being used. From a monetary perspective, and this is where we have to, take away the hype, right? Every company I see, health tech company that I meet, 99% of the time they'd say, we are an AI company. And I just kind of, sink my head into the ground and say, really, if we look at the hype from a monetary perspective, from valuations, from the amount of money that is being pumped into health tech and these so-called AI solutions, it was mainstreamed about at least 3 years ago, probably before that in the US actually. So it really depends what we mean. These are just some examples, again, non-exhaustive list, no conflict of interest to declare with them, just some examples of what we see as AI solutions in the market. The point I want to make, though, is whether or not they are truly AI solutions by the original definition, that's obviously questionable. Is it true that data seems to suggest that AI may be able to detect some conditions better than humans? Get asked this question a lot as a doctor. And the truth is, again, we have to be careful of the media hype, and we have to understand the messages that are being shared. So years ago, about 6 years ago, actually, just before I left full-time practice, Jeremy Hunt out of the UK, those of you who are from the UK probably know Jeremy Hunt, or the name. He gave what was in the newspaper rash advice to Google kids' spots. And while it was not publicized in the media, when I was working in Oxford back in 2012, a doctor messaged me a few years later who I knew, saying that a patient, a mother, listened to this, years later, Googled a rash, turned out to be meningitis. Google said it wasn't. She didn't bring her child to the hospital and the child died. Very, very unfortunate outcome. So we have to be really careful, because at the end of the day, we are dealing with people and we are dealing with people's lives. For a company called Babylon, which is very familiar to many, I'm sure, in this part of the world, they used their technology, their AI, to do an exam, right, and measure it against trainees. And they stated that the AI had beat human doctors handily. Now, that may have been the case for that cohort of students or trainees, etc. But what is the clinical implication of that? We have to be very careful with those messages. What does that actually mean? So coming to kind of the main topic of this talk, are there any regulations or laws related to AI in healthcare, in particularly locally, regionally, and or globally? And my short answer is no. There are no regulatory and legal frameworks today that I know of, at least, that exist specifically to health tech and the regulation and the legal side of things. However, that said, does anything exist? And sure, a number of things exist that I thought I'd share. In Singapore, we have AI Singapore, great organization and website and tool that basically has 3 key pillars. They focus on AI research, AI technology, and AI innovation. However, there is nothing specific in terms of those regulatory and legal frameworks when it comes to health tech specifically. We do globally and locally have explanations as to why we don't, frameworks to help us along the way, and then guidelines. So if I share this with you chronologically, in 2017, there was this article, and I would consider this an explanation. If you just focus on the 3rd circle at the bottom of this page, it states that because AI and technology is advancing so fast, that governments and organizations are going to have difficulty keeping up with it. And that's the truth, right? I mean, our iPhones, our laptops, we constantly buy new ones, right? Every couple of years, because the technology is evolving so quickly. So it's a challenge to actually keep up with what is happening in this space, okay? Hence, we have things like explanations. If we talk about frameworks from a Singapore perspective, in 2019 January, so now 3 years, the first edition of an accountability-based framework that talks specifically on the governance of AI use and technology, etc., was published, and that's publicly available. In it, I have to again call out, if you look here on the left, it is sector agnostic. Do they have anything specifically in health tech? Not really. And on the right, they talk about the issues that relate to the legal liabilities, right? But in healthcare, that's a little bit different, right? Who is liable? a clinician, a provider, a nurse, a physio who's using it? Is it the company? Is it the mobile provider that is, allowing the use of this technology through a mobile app? It becomes a very, very complex question. And there are very few legal entities out there who have built big practices on this. And that's because it's new, right? One useful article, or rather guideline, is from the EU. And that was back in April of 2019, so about 3 years ago. And I've kind of put the main thing in bold here, right? Trustworthy AI has 3 components. It has to be lawful, it has to be ethical, and it has to be robust. And so from a health tech perspective, I would agree with this. And I would say, as a clinician or as any form of provider, an allied health professional, make sure that what you use and what you advocate has followed the laws that exist at that point in time, that it is ethical in the way you practice, and it is robust and is on sound technology. Often, and I find this very, very surprising, I work with a lot of startups across the globe, and it amazes me as to how many haven't truly clinically validated their solution yet, or haven't identified the right problem from a clinical standpoint. It amazes me, and people laugh. People think I'm mad, but they really haven't, and that's a concern. And hence, we have companies like Theranos and others that have even tried to come into Singapore and have failed or have shut down. Our own colleague, Dr. Niam from NUH, in May 2019, he published a paper in the Lancet, which is amazing. Lancet, one of the most difficult academic publications to publish in. I liked his graphic, and so I shared it here, and I've provided the source, right? He came up with this kind of visual of, when you are thinking about AI and implementing it, what should you do? So it starts with, defining or redefining the clinical problem, and then he shares with you, what do you do? How do you extract the data? Do a trial, a prospective trial, and then find the clinical deployment. Simple graphic, but this addresses a lot of the problem that we see in health tech globally. Most recently, about 5 months ago, our Ministry of Health published a really good guideline on artificial intelligence in healthcare. So this is now a specific guidelines for AI in healthcare. And to those of you who may not have come across it or who may not have read it, I suggest you do at least look at the key recommendations that I've shared here in terms of the development and implementation of AI and what the guidelines actually suggest anyone in this space does. I guess to end, a few years ago, I gave a talk on augmented and virtual reality in healthcare. And I always think about things now, like even today, AI in healthcare. I think we should start saying, what is the reality in healthcare? Not really the virtual reality. What I shared, the perspectives at the start of this talk, what if, I told you a hospital wouldn't exist? Kind of those models, as you saw, already exist today. So it's nothing futuristic. I always joke and say, you know what? Telemedicine, everyone's talking about it. Geez, telemedicine's been around for 20 years. When I was in the early 2000s, we would phone a friend. We would bleep our colleague to get a second opinion. That was all telemedicine, right? It's just in a different format. It's nothing new. We've had teleanesthesia. We've even done care in space, years ago. Nothing new. That's all telemedicine. If you look at how kind of technology is changing, on the top left, this is kind of how grand rounds or medical teaching was in the 20th century, early 20th century. And even, I would say, even in the 90s when I was training, right, this is how we taught. And we still do a little bit of teaching like this, but on the bottom right, a lot of organizations have gone to this modality of teaching rounds using digital technology. The bottom left is a very, very important picture. And if it's one message I would like to share today, it is about this picture here on the left. To those who don't recognize this gentleman, his name is Abraham Vargas. And if you have time, about 17 and a half minutes to be exact, I would recommend you spend 17 and a half minutes Googling and listening to this man's talk. He was a professor at Stanford. He got chided by his colleagues for coming up with the term the eye patient, because he got very frustrated seeing grand rounds being taught in the way on the bottom right rather than the human touch. And he said, instead of being in a room, all of you residents looking at the computer screen and looking at the eye patient, you should be going to the end of the bed and looking at the patient. And I think that holds true today. It has to be a mix. And I hope we don't lose the human side of medicine. So Google him, Abraham Vargas, Verghese, and just Google Abraham Vargas TED talk, and you can listen to his talk. At the end of the day, technology is really a double-edged sword. I think I've explained why I feel safe quality care versus the human touch is kind of a balance that, I hope where we see that the human touch weighs down more. As a clinician, I've always believed that we should use technology to complement our practices rather than replace them. Not because I'm a doctor and I want to be out of a job. I've left full-time medicine. I'm only part-time, so it doesn't really affect me. But for many reasons, I genuinely hope that we don't lose that human touch. On that, thanks very much, and hope this was insightful, and happy to share the presentation.